and I believe she got a bunch of killers to run an experiment to see if slugging overall was more effective than just, playing the game normally. My stance on this is for most killers in the game, I do not see slugging everyone to death. We're talking about 4-man bleedouts, or at least 4-man everyone's on the ground, then you hook once people start dying. You basically don't hook people the entire game. Where I do not see that as stronger than just regular hooking and slugging for, pressure. When people are grouped up, I'm not saying obviously don't slug, but only slugging I don't find to be as strong as slugging when it makes sense and when it's smart to do. So she's making the argument that slugging is stronger, I believe. I think that was the stance she took. I have not watched this yet, so I'm not sure, but I was really curious to see the data involved in all this stuff because I personally do not see that being the case. I can see a couple of killers doing that, like Blight or like Billy, Nurse even. Any killers that have insane map control probably benefit a bit more from purely slugging. I can see that. Even Dracula. I could see that. But every other killer in the game, I can't see it. Was it done in private games? No, I believe this was done in public games. She asked a bunch of streamers to just do this. I don't know. Let's watch it. And I fundamentally disagree with the premise, but let's see.
Despite what the internet may think, this experiment wasn't born out of hatred for survivors or overall malicious intent. Instead, this was born out of genuine curiosity and the fact that the metatides in DBD are changing, but not necessarily for the better. Fair warning, there is a lot to go over, so I will have included timestamps above and in the comment section for those with short attention spans to be able to click through. Over the years within Dead by Daylight, we've seen different metas curated by behavior, whether it was intentional or not. As they buffed or nerfed killers or buffed or nerfed perks, the ebbs and flows of gameplay have been something that most players have had to adapt to. One thing I've personally noticed, however, is that the time sink for killers seems to have been gapped by the amount of time survivors are given in-game, which can be noted as a good or a bad thing. The majority of our player base plays DBD as a solo team member or in a duo group, leading to a lot of mishaps that behavior has done a relatively good job at trying to close the gap of, either with the inclusion of the activity HUD or the overall buffs to perks that allow survivors to be more self-sufficient. It does show that they are trying to do some good as a development company to help those that most need it in the form of our solo queue warriors. However, this time and energy has to be taken from a different source, leaving many killers, especially those on the lower tier end, to pick up the pieces and scratch whatever extra time in-game they can from what's being taken from them. The most recent and notable change being that the hook timers were increased by 10 seconds with patch notes 8.2. This is one of the more controversial takes of the year, and to those who only play Survivor, it may
I feel
not
like,
seem like a big
as an aside, people do not take advantage of that enough. People, I really wish people would learn the value of the duration of a single hook state. Like, that is one of, I think, the biggest things that people fuck up in solo queue. They just, as soon as someone's on the hook, it's like they need to immediately be unhooked. It's like you can sit there for 69 seconds doing jack shit, and if the killer's pressuring that area to try to tunnel them or camp them or do whatever, they just waste so much time not dying. And oftentimes, unhooking someone immediately just causes them to just die 10 times faster. So I do wish people used hook states more as an actual currency resource in the match, because it's just super important.
But from competitive players to public players, this feels like a damning blow. While the intent of helping those left to struggle because of poor performance or fumbled priorities seems like a positive one, killer mains across multiple skills and platforms feel as if they're being left in the dust by poor dev decisions, especially because this change was one that seemed relatively unwarranted or requested. If we consider the time sink for killers, between the average chase time to down a survivor, checking if the area is clear from a flashlight save or a pallet save, reloading weapons, walking over to a hook, multiplied by 12 hook stages, a lot of time is lost for killers. When you factor in the benefit...
I feel like people make that argument a lot too. I don't know why, I'm not saying she's claiming this, but a lot of people just go, it's all slugging or you have to get 12 hooks. I don't know why there can't be a nuance. I never get 12 hooks. 12 hooks is fucking impossible. Like, it's okay to win with 7 or 8 or 9 hooks or something like that. That is a very common, normal thing to do. I think it's a little disingenuous to always assume that 12 hooks is the other end of the discussion here. Like, no one's trying that shit. I mean, I try it, but I very often am not able to get 12 hooks. So I don't think that should be that is well above and beyond what you're expected to do as killer. That's too nice. Even for me, that's too nice. So
of hooking. Killers have 27 perks that they can gain benefits from when hooking, while survivors have 29 perks to benefit from once being hooked, and an additional 25 perks for resetting or healing once being injured. On top of this interaction, certain
If that's a defense for slugging being stronger, that there's technically like 2 less perks that have to deal with that, or there's like more there's more it's the quality of the perk that matters, right? If there was a single anti-slug perk that was like the greatest perk in the game, it would still make slugging worse than hooking if there were 7,000 other shitty hook perks, you know what I mean? I think the quality of the perk matters more than the amount of the perks that are actually there that benefit that particular thing, whether it be slugging or hooking. So that's way more important. Yeah, like Unbreakable is infinitely more valuable than, I don't know, name some random off the perk or off the hook perk. Like even Borrowed Time. Borrowed Time, while nice, is not really super necessary because if a killer's going to tunnel, they likely just hit you in the face off the hook immediately. And that just sort of kind of counters it. Like, whereas Unbreakable, for example, can just single-handedly win you the game because you don't even know it's there. Yeah, I would say Babysitter's better for sure now. But my point is, like, just because there are more perks that interact with hooks doesn't mean that it's better to not have to deal with those, because honestly, the anti-slugging perks now, I think, are stronger than... I think they're stronger than the hook-related perks. Like, We're Gonna Live Forever now is fucking insane. I think you'd be crazy to try to slug everyone every single game with We're Gonna Live Forever right now. It's genuinely harder, in my opinion. It's like, oh god, it's so stressful.
Builds and perk stacking make survivors particularly obnoxious to deal with when attempting to hook the down survivor, like the combination of either stackable Sabo perks like Breakout or the lone existence of background player. Not to mention, after being unhooked, survivors can become little mini anti-tunneling gods, tanking Hell State after Hell State with several different second chance perks, which would be an issue if you were actively
What lets you take more than one bonus health state off the hook? How do you take health state after health state? I'm guessing maybe you have off the record into DS, maybe is what they're getting at. Probably off the record into DS. They're not talking about fucking Metal Man. I think they're referring to off the record DS because there's no other. You can't stack multiple layers of endurance. It's not going to help you. Yeah, it's probably that. At which point, if someone is being obnoxious and blocking you like that, you could always just slug them. Like, nothing is forcing you to hook them up. Dead hard if you use DS as well. Yeah, I guess if they have literally a 4 anti-tunnel perk build, then sure. But if that happens, if someone is that obviously trying to like force themselves in my way, I usually just slug them and then keep chasing the original guy. That buys me pressure. I don't have to deal with their entire build now, and I'm still fine. They're gonna run Unbreakable. How many fucking perks these people have? They have a full anti-tunnel and anti-slug build. That means they have no exhaustion perk? Like, or you're saying Dead Hard too? Yeah, we're talking about 5 perks now.
Tunneling. But if you're trying to avoid said survivor, you end up dealing with a bottlenecked, freshly healed survivor taking chase, tanking a Hell State into an Endurance hit, into Decisive Strike, into a Dead Hard, which begs the question,
okay, that was
what
exactly
if we ignore this interaction altogether?
Then you have to deal with Mate for this, you gotta deal with They're Gonna Live Forever, you gotta deal with Exponential, you gotta deal with,
Well, this experiment
Buckle Up, you gotta deal with Flip Flop, you gotta Power Struggle, you gotta deal with
data. I figured this wouldn't be sufficient enough evidence to support my claim, or to gain a better understanding on if...
Couldn't you ignore the situation by not tunneling off the guy the hook? The situation she's referring to is when you have that obnoxious person that gets unhooked and then tries to body block for the unhooker and just like stands in their way. I find that it's almost impossible for them to really successfully do that unless you're in like a skinny hallway. If you're in like, like Midwich or something like that, and the unhook happens in the room and then the unhook guy sits in the doorway to block it, then yeah, then that can be very obnoxious. But most of the time, you can just walk around them. Like, you're faster than the survivor. They can't body block you for more than a couple of seconds as long as you just trick them up for like a second or two. It's really not hard to get around somebody. But yeah, there are certain scenarios and like skinny walkways and stuff like that where it can be really annoying. And I think that's the specific scenario she's talking about, which I feel like doesn't happen that often, but it can happen.
Ignoring hooking survivors would work better in today's meta than following the standard objective. I reached out to killer mains from all walks of Earth with my experiment. Simply play 20 games of DBD, 10 normal, and 10 games where they couldn't hook any survivors till all
That's
4
not a
were
huge
on
sample
the floor,
size.
forcing survivors to reorganize their priorities since the killers...
That's a pretty small sample size. I get not wanting to do a lot more of this because that's ass. I'm completely fine with being a small sample size, but that's not going to give you too much accuracy because although you are getting a bunch of data from several different people, you're not getting consistent data. You need consistent data from the same people in the same MMR in the same region at the same time kind of thing if you really want to have a fair comparison. So it's not super accurate data, but I completely understand not wanting to do more. Can I turn it up more? Yeah, I can. There you go.
Weren't typically playing as expected, as well as seeing if this general playstyle would outperform and counteract the majority of Survivor builds. When you consider Survivor builds, of the top 20 used perks from Nightlight, only one perk really sticks out as an anti-slugging perk, while for Killer, 7 of the top 20 used perks have to do with a hooking interaction. I figured this left the slugging playstyle wide open to be taken advantage of since survivors are currently unprepared to handle it more often than not. With the majority of hooking perks not providing much substance in game, changing the build didn't cause too much of a...
Is that the argument? That people are just simply unprepared for it? If that's the case, then I think that it's a lot more of a solid argument because the slugging meta hasn't really fully been established. But now that we're gonna live rivers here, I have to imagine that it cannot be more effective.
Fuss for the majority of the killers. While Pop and Pain Res are the most popular aggression perks
Oh my
to run,
god, you're right. Look at this build. That is fucking pure evil. Jesus Christ. Yeah, I'm glad there was not a bigger sample size because so many games would be so miserable.
Many of the killers in the game are also able to take advantage of Jolt.
In this gameplay, solo players can't see the down players because of third seal knockout. It's not that they're unprepared. That's a good point. It's that they're physically incapable of doing anything about it. In solo queue, that's true. Their preparation wouldn't really matter there. What can you do to stop knockout? What can you do to stop like third seal? I guess you could bring like, I don't know, a map or something.
However, the builds were split between either going for a build that benefited slugging, such as third seal or knockout, versus just an overall complementary build for the killer with a regression perk that synergized well with the killer, or just foregoing everything completely. The only killers I did not get to account for in this experiment were Ghostface, Demogorgon, and Twins. So just third seal or knockout, versus just an overall complementary build for the killer with a regression perk that synergized well with...
She said with a regression perk that synergized well. Are we I guess I'm sure we'll see later, because if we're comparing a fully committed slug build to a single slowdown perk based off a hook, then that is not at all fair whatsoever. Because if you stack 4 hook-related slowdown perks, obviously you're going to get insane value from hooking people. But I guess we'll see. Hopefully.
The killer, or just foregoing everything completely. The only killers I did not get to account for in this experiment were Ghostface, Demogorgon, and Twins. So I do apologize to those who main those killers, as I cannot find an adequate main to fulfill the request in the time frame given.
Oh, I see, Murphy's okay.
For following the scientific method, my personal hypothesis is as follows. Slugging games would outperform the hooking games, not only in time frame, but in the amount of builds that would be negated would also be more than the hooking games. I do acknowledge that certain killers' playstyles are naturally geared towards slugging, as is the case with Oni, Plague, Myers, or Twins, as well as killers that already ignore hook states such as Pyramid.
I do agree with that fundamental idea, though, that the pure slugging only bleed out playstyle would, on average, counter more perks than playing normally. And that's only because this hasn't taken hold, and if it did, it simply wouldn't be true anymore. But due to sheer unexpectedness, because no one really plays like this, I can understand that argument at the very least.
Head, and these would generally be outliers in the experiment. But I wanted to have as much included in my data as I could. Killers were tasked with not only tracking their win rate, but the maps that they played on, the length of their matches, the amount of salt that they witnessed, the amount of DCs that occurred, as well as what the survivor builds contained, whether they had anti-tunneling perks.
Oh, I just thought of a fundamental thing that could completely ruin all this data. If we're going for slugging everyone for the 4K kind of thing, you don't have to worry about hatch. Hatch is never going to be an issue because no one will ever get it unless it, I guess, spawns directly under someone after you're hooking like the last guy. You'll never have to worry about hatch, though. If you're playing normally, people might get hatch, and if hatch is counted in the kill rate, that would horribly skew the stats. I think if you get 3 kills, you've won. Whether the 4th person gets hatch or not because you just don't want to slug them, hopefully they took that into account, and 3 kills is a win. Because slugging inherently has hatch protection built into it, and if you're getting more kills because of that, and you're accounting for the hatch escapes, then that sort of kills all of this data, so we'll see.
Perks, Sabo builds, non-meta or meta builds, and finally, the amount of gens that were completed. When we compared the results of the experiment, despite my initial hypothesis, I was quite surprised with how well slugging did overall. Slugging matches were overall shorter, more effective, and resulted in less gen completion for killers.
Also, Sorry, I keep stopping, but I guess I have to do that. Otherwise, I'm just legit stealing content. Something that you have to account for as well is the mental aspect of slugging people. What are survivors far more likely to do if you slug them for half the match? The obvious answer is not give a shit and give up immediately and just go AFK or something. So I think it's sort of the skull merchant effect, where people are far less likely to actually give a shit and try to live during the match, and that will artificially inflate the rates by a lot. You can see Skull Merchant had the highest kill rate for God knows how long, despite not even being that good of a killer. It's because no one wants to go against it. And if you have someone that's running Knockout on third seal and Giga Slugging, people are far more likely to instantly check out of that match mentally. Even if they get picked back up, they'll probably just go minimize and jerk off or something. So that is a huge factor that needs to be accounted for.
Average, survivors completed 1.91 gens when the killers went for a slugging playstyle, while when hooking is normal, survivors completed 2.6. Now, this does account for all of the killers, from S to D tier, but to have almost double the average is surprising. Out of the 710 games that were played, when it came to slugging, they had almost a fourth of their games where no gens were completed.
That makes sense. It's a lot more snowbally, so you would have a lot more situations like that. Yeah, that makes sense.
With another quarter accounting for only one gen being completed. When it came time for endgame, only 14% of the games for slugging came to that point, while 20% of the games for hooking ended up with all of the gens being completed. However, one thing was noted with this experiment is that the gates were more likely to be open for the slugging game when the exit gates were powered versus the hooking game, most likely due to the more every man for himself nature of endgame. The games that did make it to endgame were reported to be a little bit more frustrating than hooking, as the defense was a bit weaker and harder to secure than if someone were on a hook. So, gens were definitely on the downturn with slugging. But if coordinated teams were able to make it to endgame, they had a much better escape rate than their slugged counterparts.
Interesting.
When it came to the win rate, we're getting a 4K is the win condition. 85% of games were won when slugging, while only 75% of games were won when hooking.
What does that mean, though? I need to know what that means. That is such an important distinction. Does that mean 3K or up, or 4K is the win condition? Is 4K involving hatch? I need to know the hatch. The hatch is so important to this discussion. She said 4K. I know, but I'm saying, like, when I say I 4K'd, if someone gets the hatch or not, I still consider it a 4K. That's why I'm wondering what this means. Because in the hook game, it's far more likely for people to get hatch, right? That's what I mean.
Securing a 4K was overall reportedly much easier because all survivors were accounted for once they were on the ground. With the new finisher Mori system, which was introduced after all the data was submitted, you no longer have to worry about one survivor's Kobe potential, instead being able to secure the 4K that much quicker. As an outlier within the experiment, the nurse had a reportedly lower win rate mainly because the last survivor often ended up baiting their team for hatch, resulting in significantly more 3Ks on hook than the amount of 4Ks for the slugging game. Since behavior's win con and overall focus in game is the kills being the most important aspect for the killer,
so she
especially
is
with the
counting
inclusion of the final survivor Mori system, going for slugging over hooking resulted in a higher win percentage as well as shorter.
Okay, so she actually is. That's good. She did account for that, but I think that severely weakens the point that slugging is so much stronger. Like, I'm really glad that she accounted for that, but that when you slug, you have built-in hatch protection. When you're playing the game normally and just doing occasional slugs like that, it's far more likely for someone to get the hatch. It doesn't mean you performed worse or anything like that. It just means you're less sweaty and you don't give a shit if one guy gets out of the hatch or not. You still won the match, you know? And that's a huge distinction. You don't see the point of this? Isn't it mind-numbingly boring for Killer 2? I mean, they weren't assaulted. I'm sure they agreed to do it, and they weren't ordered to do it. 3K and a hatch escape is a 4K. Yeah, I would consider those in terms of like a victory the same thing. The problem is she's using the direct definition of how MMR works in this game to determine which is more effective, which is a super competitive way to look at it that doesn't really have a tangible effect on the outcome of how well you actually did. It just gives you, I guess, more MMR, but that doesn't really change the impact of how you perform during the actual match.
Games. When we compare the overall kill rate for slugging versus hooking, 3% of games for slugging resulted in no kills versus 2% for the hooking games. 4% of games resulted in 1K versus 2% for hooking. 3% of games for slugging resulted in a 2K versus 6% for hooking. 3% of games for slugging resulted in a 3K versus 14% for hooking. And finally, 85% of games resulted in a 4K for slugging versus 74% for hooking.
Yeah,
In regards to
that's
match
a huge
length,
difference here. Look,
4K for slugging versus 74% for hooking.
it's that missing 15% or whatever, or like there's like that missing 12% is
In
literally
regards
all
to
hatch.
match length, on average, the slugging games were 5 to 10 minutes, while the hooking games were 10 to 15 minutes. The time sink of either worrying about flashlight saves, sabos, pallet saves, or just making it to your scourge hook was completely taken out of the equation with leaving survivors on the ground and patrolling the area while pressuring gens, showcasing an almost trap killer playstyle without having to worry about the anti-camp mechanic that would normally plague killers.
Hatch is no. If you get hatch, you don't gain him. You don't. Hatch is neutral. You don't gain MMR if you get hatch as survivor. And as a killer, I believe it's just neutral as well. It's just neutral. I really want to see their non slugging builds
in this situation. While admittedly some of the lower tier killers did struggle with the slugging playstyle, the higher rated killers reported quicker games overall. When going over survivor reactions, one thing that was not surprising were the survivors being upset. Understandably, being slugged isn't always the preferred action, especially for survivors that are itching to go next. By keeping survivors slugged, they aren't given the easy way out, forcing them to decide whether they want to wait out the match on the floor, actually try to escape in the game, or DC and wait out the penalty. One of the biggest frustrations in the game right now is the fact that survivors seem to be so often giving up on the first hook, especially if the chases don't go as planned, or if it's a killer they don't like to go against. By keeping the survivors in game by slugging and not giving them
I don't know. Is this a slug build, or is this a... This is probably a slug build, right? This seems way more slug heavy. There's no hook related anything here. Infectious fright. This seems like a slug build, no?
the easy way out, the DC percentage did rise to almost double. At least one DC occurred in 40% of matches when slugging versus 19% of matches when hooking, as well as the salt percentage, where salt occurred in 37% of matches versus 20% when hooking. As someone who does play Survivor, I do acknowledge that this isn't the most fun playstyle to go against, but I also want to acknowledge the changing tides for killers to see if there's actually a more preferable way to complete the objective with the constantly changing meta and evolving playstyles. As mentioned earlier, the majority of the meta when it comes to survivors stem from second chance perks, healing perks, or exhaustion perks, leaving them unprepared and uncoordinated when it came to the slugging experiment. Builds were split into 6 sections, containing either anti-tunnel perks like DS or Off the Record, anti-slugging perks like Exponential or Unbreakable, a mix of tunneling and slugging perks, containing a Sabo build, a build that had none of the above but is mostly meta, and finally a build that had none of the above and contained no meta. Anti-tunneling perks accounted for 865 builds across 2,840 survivors, totaling 30% of builds in-game. Anti-slugging perks had a significantly less percentage of 220 survivors, or 7% of builds.
When was this done? Because I'm willing to bet We're Gonna Live Forever has probably single-handedly doubled this rate by now, just by sheer nature of how insanely strong that perk is. That probably is way higher right now. Way higher. This was before the change. Okay, then yeah, this is no longer accurate. I mean, it's not her fault, but yeah, this is no longer accurate. I would have to imagine you have way more We're Gonna Live Forevers now.
Expected, the majority of survivors ran meta builds containing exhaustion or gen completion perks, but because there were so few slugging perks, it left the playstyle wide open. Saboing was another factor that weighed in with the initial hypothesis, but it ended up having a lower percentage than expected, accounting for 78 survivors, or 2.74% of builds. Regarding the anti-tunneling portion of builds, when the slugging matches commenced and the hooking matches started, there was a significant uptick in frustration when it came to dealing with the amount of anti-tunneling perks that the survivors were running. Despite 1/4 of survivors running anti-tunneling perks, oftentimes those survivors were the most annoying to deal with many killers reporting having DS and Off the Record weaponized against them, and having to deal with the anti-tunneling perks, even when they weren't tunneling. Many killers reported feeling less frustration in their slugging matches for this reasoning. The minimal anti-slug perks did pose issues in a few games, especially on the maps where there was a hidden exponential that was difficult to find, or in a few matches where Soul Guard came into play against the killer's hex perks. Finally, another big factor in gameplay is what maps the killers were sent to, either by survivor map offerings or by RNG. Maps in this game are another frustrating factor in my opinion, as for certain killers, it can often mean the game is over before it begins. Behavior doesn't do the best in map prioritization or balancing in my opinion, but maps that the killers played on were diverse enough that we were able to pool a significant amount of data to compare the matches to. I'll do the win percentage for the most common maps that were revealed, as well as the best maps for slugging and the best maps for hooking. There were several maps where the slugging games had a 100% win rate, but the comparison to hooking matches didn't provide sufficient enough evidence in my opinion, as is the cases for Coal Tower, Cowshed, Dead Dog, Pale Rose, Temple, and Wreckers, where those maps had a 100% win rate for slugging, but the amount of matches played between slugging and hooking was too high of a variance. For example, Dead Dog had a 100% win rate, but it was only across 3 matches, where hooking had a 24% win rate across 17 matches. So I didn't feel like it was the best comparison. Only one map in the realm was completely even, which was Ironworks, where both playstyles had 8 matches each on the map, and both resulted in an 87% win rate. The most popular maps in the experiment were Ormond, RPD, Meat Plant, Preschool, and Garden of Joy. For Ormond, slugging had an 88% win rate, and hooking had an 82% win.
Damn, what? The killers in this experiment won only 28% of the time? That's like below the average. What the fuck? I know Garden of Joy sucks ass, don't get me wrong. That's insanely low. Batum was 71%? I feel like Batum is worse than Garden of Joy. It is only 7 matches, but still. What killers did they play? Yeah, what killers did they play? What add-ons did they use? What build did they have? Like, there's so many more variables that go into this. I mean, if these guys are all playing, no add-on Myers, then 28% win rate on Garden of Joy sounds perfectly accurate. But, if they're playing, Blight or someone like that, they should be still getting wins almost every game. So, yeah, the type of killer, unfortunately, this doesn't really mean much of anything. This is just... Didn't she mention they played 3 killers earlier? I see Myers here. I don't remember if that was for all of them. If so, then I apologize.
Win rate. For RPD, slugging had a 100% win rate, while hooking had a 61% win rate. For Meat Plant,
they didn't
slugging
play
had an 88% win rate, and hooking had a 76% win rate. For Preschool, slugging had a 93% win rate, and hooking had a 71% win rate.
You would have to run the experiment with the same killer, with the same add-ons. Yeah, it would be extremely boring to do this correctly, so I don't blame her for not doing it.
And for Garden of Joy, slugging had an 88% win rate, and hooking had a 28% win rate. The best maps for slugging were RPD, Midwich, Preschool, Meat Plant, and Garden of Joy. For slugging, they had a 100% win rate for RPD, while hooking had a 71% win rate. For Midwich, slugging had a 92% win rate, and hooking had a 55% win rate. For the Preschool maps, slugging had a 93% win rate, and hooking had a 7%.
Indoor maps make sense being good for slugging. I kind of find that weird. I actually think it would be the opposite, because knockout is still proximity based, right? And if you're on the game, you're far more likely to be on top of a survivor because it's 2 stacking floors. So I feel like you're more likely to randomly walk upon where a survivor is if you're on an indoor map, because they're typically smaller and multi-floored, which means you can cover twice the ground at once. Oh, I guess if you have third seal too, yeah, then I guess you're fucked. It's true.
1% win rate. For Meat Plant, slugging had an 88% win rate, and hooking had a 76% win rate. And for Garden of Joy, slugging had an 88% win rate, and hooking had a 28% win rate. The best maps for hooking were Disturbed Ward, Azarov's, Family Residence, Groaning Storehouse, and Forgotten Ruins. On Disturbed Ward, slugging had a 63%
It's cool that she tracked all this, but I don't think this really means anything.
For Azarov's, slugging had an 83% win rate, and hooking had a 100% win rate. For Family Residence, slugging had an 80% win rate, and hooking had a 100% win rate. For Groaning Storehouse, slugging had a 71% win rate, and hooking had a 100% win rate. And finally, for Forgotten Ruins, slugging had a 62% win rate.
Forgotten Ruins, 62%. That's it. That's all the data I need. How the hell do you have a 62% win rate on Forgotten Ruins? That's killer. It is like fucking impossible to lose on that map. Honestly, probably because you can hook people just in your shitty little stupid 3-gen upstairs and they can't do anything about it.
Rate. I tried to choose a map pool variance that had close enough comparisons, but I will have the entire graphic shown to showcase all of the maps in-game. Torment Creek is another outlier, as it did not show up in any of the games for the killers while hooking. While I understand this was a lot to go over, I appreciate any sort of patience you had while I explain the results of the experiment. I also want to acknowledge some fallacies that could be brought up when arguing against this experiment. One, the match data pool could be too small, but I didn't feel comfortable asking a multitude of killers to play 50 to 100
Completely
matches
understandable.
and record every instance in every match in order for me to collect data. I figured 20 matches, 10 of which would be the experiment, and the other 10 would be control for comparison, would be an easy enough request, as many killers completed the experiment over the course of one stream or one play session. Another variable after this experiment was the recent changes in patches 8.3, most notably the changes to several healing perks for survivors, such as We're Gonna Live Forever, which was completely unwarranted in my opinion. Anti-tunneling perks such as Blood Rush, anti-healing perks like Leverage and Blood Echo, as well as hook perks like Dead Man's Switch, which I'm still heartbroken over. It's a hard variable to see if after the patch settled, how often you'd come across these perks, and if there would be a stark change in matches or meta. But I do see Wiglif posing an issue for matches, since it gives survivors bootleg fuckle up once again with a combination of Wiglif and Made for This, which is another complaint and story altogether. I also acknowledge the difference in hour set and MMR for the players. The hour range was 1.5k all the way up to I believe 13k. This is a huge variance to account for, and the experience that some of the players had in-game might tip the scales in their favor, as they'd be more likely to accommodate unsavory situations, builds, or maps that would be against the killer that they played. If I were ever to recreate it, I would like to see a beginner, intermediate, and experienced person do matches for each killer, to see the results that would align with the hour set that would reflect upon the more casual player base. And finally, the servers where this experiment was performed. The majority of the player base was in North America, but I understand that every server has their own preferences in regards to meta, playstyles, and how they feel about each killer. A player primarily playing on Japanese servers would most likely play a little bit differently or run a completely different build than someone who plays on European servers.
How smart.
Again,
You try to get
if
grabbed.
it could be replicated to the extent that I mentioned, I would have done so. So for now, please understand that I wanted to get as much data as possible while not taking up too much time.
Oh, there it is. The Wiglif
While I don't
begins.
necessarily think that this will result in a complete overhaul with the way that people play, it does showcase that you have more than the standard hooking option to follow when in game, especially in situations where you feel like the match is out of your hands. There have been a multitude of discussions lately where killer mains often feel like behavior is taking time away from them in game with the more recent hook timer buffs, reset buffs, healing buffs, anti-camp meter, and nerfs to the more popular regression perks that you would be able to utilize after hooking survivors. It's not that I necessarily want this meta to be preferred, but I think that there is an issue with the fact that the playstyle is more advantageous than the one in-game. This also isn't a call to buff anti-slug perk.
Yeah, that is, I still completely disagree with that. And again, maybe if they did this, if she did this again, with, shit like We're Gonna Live Forever, I feel like the meta has already shifted to where this is not a good idea anymore, like at all. Just simply like one or two people with We're Gonna Live Forever. Like if you have someone with We're Gonna Live Forever and Made for This, that just completely dismantles this strategy like entirely. You don't even need someone to have Unbreakable. Just a single person with Made for This and We're Gonna Live Forever just shits on slugging so much because you both get endurance. You pick people up faster than the killer can down them. It just destroys all this pressure. There's a middle ground between 4-man slugs and hooking everyone. Yeah, of course. I slug too, but I only slug when it makes sense to do so, when it's advantageous and not borderline cruel, like to just go out of your way to do. I know they're not trying to be cruel doing this, by the way. They're just trying to see if this is stronger or not. But I can tell you, as a survivor going against it, it kind of is a little cruel. It's a little fucked up to do to solo queue players. So the main reason I'm like so staunchly against this is because I do not want this to become the meta. And even though the meta would adjust and perks would alleviate a lot of the pain, I would still not prefer people start thinking that this is the correct way to play. Because A, I guarantee half the people will have no idea even how to do it properly, and this will still just bitch survivors are OP. But B, going against it, even with the perks to counter it, are miserable. Did you guys watch that Dracula game that we had our 4-man in? It was Zubat, Jen, Miasma, and I. And do you see how miserable that was? Because all he was doing was slugging. Like, he wasn't hooking anybody. I mean, he hooked me because he tunneled me out, but then the rest of the game was just slugging over and over and over for like 3 minutes each on everybody. And then he ended up losing because we weren't a solo queue team that actually had the potential to deal with it. We had Made for This and We're Gonna Live Forever and shit like that, so we were able to deal with that. But like expecting a solo queue team to deal with that, impossible. Like just straight up impossible. So
but instead give better incentives in-game to killers in order to hook. I would also like to preface by saying that I have an equal amount of hours in both Killer and Survivor over the years that I've played DBD, so this is not a wholly killer-sided take. I'm mainly looking for incentives like Old Barbecue,
yeah, there's a lot
where
of that
you were
game.
given a
It's a couple days
percentage
ago.
of BP incentive for survivors hooked, or minute changes to pain res, as multiple matches have been stuck with poor spawns and terrible usage when I've had no choice but to lose a stack. However, the purpose of this video is merely to showcase and explain the data for the experiment, not necessarily provide solutions or fix any potential problems in-game. The final section of this video is more of a statement from all of the killers as well as the slugging versus hooking dataset. While going over the killer data, I will try to be as concise as possible, but as mentioned earlier, I will include timestamps so that y'all can skip to your specific killer interest if you do not feel like hearing about every single killer. Those who participate in the experiment will have all of their information in the description box as well, so if you have any additional questions, they will be available to ask. Dracula is definitely one of the more interesting figures in the fog, as he has 3 different powers at hand to utilize in chase, and per our Dracula players, he also excelled greatly in the amount of pressure he put on survivors.
Okay, so they're actually... Jesus. Okay, so no, they're actually using, like, well, I don't know. It's 2 hook-related perks, I guess. Well, no, I guess No Way Out counts. Never mind. No, that tracks. We're good.
During the experiment. While not a single match was lost for our Dracula players, resulting in a perfect 4K rate of 100% across the board, the slugging matches were significantly quicker, with almost every match ending in less than 10 minutes, and almost half ending in less than 5 minutes. Per Scooty, playing a constant tug-of-war with survivors when slugging created a more fascinating gameplay loop, especially when there were survivors with anti-slug perks in place. Dracula was infinitely easier to slug with due to his add-on Medusa's Hair, since you could force a 15% hinder with relative ease.
Yeah,
overall, slugging was stated to be quicker and easier than the hooking counterpart. In contrast to Dracula, our Vecna main doesn't necessarily recommend slugging on their killer, as the win condition of a 4K was harder to achieve, especially because they weren't quite used to the playstyle. They did state that they do the occasional slugging, but the 4 on the floor was a rough fit for their main and had an overall feeling of frustration and was met with significantly more salt than their normal matches. However, the use of anti-tunnel perks was also more noticeable in their hooking matches, which is to be expected. The results were about the same when you compare the hooking stats to the slugging ones, so it may be a
Rapid and Saver hooking perks? Wait, what do you mean? I mean, I don't think you necessarily need to have 4 hook-related perks, because the people that, you know, their slugging builds aren't necessarily 4 slugging-related perks, so you don't necessarily need that.
Known with its flexible projectile and ability to snowball, the matches for they did state that they do the occasional slugging, but the 4 on the floor was a rough fit for their main and had an overall feeling of frustration and was met with significantly more salt than their normal matches. However, the use of anti-tunnel perks was also more noticeable in their hooking matches, which is to be expected. The results were about the same when you compare the hooking stats to the slugging ones, so it may be a matter of comfortability that would be in effect, rather than how well suited the killer's power is to the playstyle. For the Unknown, with its flexible projectile and ability to snowball, the matches for the Unknown were significantly easier when it came to slugging versus hooking, where the overall annoyance came from the amount of DCs that occurred in the match instead of the play.
Alright. I mean, this is kind of... that's kind of low on the slowdown, though. You basically have 1 hook-related perk. See, this is what I mean. There's little things like this that sort of... I don't know. This is... how is this a hook-related build? You have Pain Resonance, and that's it. Like, yeah, there's no consistency to the experiment at all. This is not really a hooking build. This is not a very sweaty build. No, this is a perfectly fine build, but I'm saying this is not like, if you're trying to find the pinnacle of slugging and the pinnacle of hooking, this is not that. We'll see that.
Styles frustration. Between both mains, the Unknown had the ability to be all over the map at different points in the game, stalling any resets.
Wait, what? What happened? What happened? How did the perk change? Oh, is this several different builds, maybe? But then Third Seal. I'm confused. Oh, it's 2 different players. 2 different players. Okay, sorry. Yeah, that I feel like that muddies it even more. Yeah, at least, you know, agitation, pop. This one makes more sense. The first one doesn't really make any sense at all.
Pickups that would occur with the slugs. Indigo noted that the general frustration came from the gifted reset perks that came with the hooking games versus the slugging, but appreciated the lack of downtime for the slugging matches had for the killer. They stated, it felt similar to how the 2v8 went when there was no downtime or need to hook anyone.
Does Nurse's Calling have a little skull in it? Has Nurse's Calling always had a little skull in it? Oh my god, I never knew that. I've never seen it, like, bigger. Holy shit. Gearhead for information. Is that Trail? And then, how is this a slugging build? I mean, I guess you don't necessarily really need many perks at all for slugging. You just got, like, Knockout and Forced Hesitation, maybe, or something? I don't know. There's really not that many. Infectious Fright.
And it felt more efficient and generally felt like the small aspects of her gameplay were improved. Both mains acknowledged that the slugging was easier than hooking, especially resulting in quicker matches, with one stating that they'd be more open to slugging for pressure because it allowed them to remove survivor pressure for free, while the other stated that they would be staying with the hooking gameplay loop, but definitely felt more confident.
That build is fucked.
But it was Slugging and adjusting a survivor's playstyles to take advantage in that route. With Chucky's 110 speed, the lack of map pressure was the biggest downfall when it came to the slugging games, where his slugging matches being a feast or famine playstyle.
Yeah, that's the thing. What like the original point I was making is there are a couple of killers that can probably benefit from this more, and the main thing they all have in common is they can all traverse the map instantly. Unknown can teleport across the map. Like I feel like every killer that's gonna do better with this is going to have some really good mobility power. Hi, buddy.
Being incredibly profitable or negating his power and pressure completely. Unbreakable was seen, but not a huge factor. However, a well-placed exponential could kill the entire game. Instead of a full slug strategy, trying to go for one and then downing another, then hooking, would be easier to adapt to than the 4 on the floor. And Dead Hard was actually more frustrating to deal with than the majority of the anti-tunnel perks. But overall, slugging wasn't quite recommended, just more of a situational suggestion of the survivors leaning into it. Slugging is definitely viable on Chucky due to his quick downing capabilities and shorter cooldown, but since the speed is a huge hinder as being a 110 killer, it's not as easily taken advantage of than some of his 115 counterparts.
Yeah.
With Xeno's tunnel system being built for macro play, for both survivor control and gen pressure, this killer's playstyle is naturally inclined more for hooking rather than slugging, and resulted in better matches overall. Coordinated teams were definitely a downfall more than others for this killer, and the lack of being able to hook and get survivors out of the game was frustrating for our Xeno. Like other killers, the more apart and ill-coordinated the survivors were, the easier it was to take advantage of the slugging playstyle. And like Chucky, the matches were either a complete breeze or incredibly stressful when trying to keep the survivors on the ground. Our Xeno stated that slugging and hooking would work well in combination of the Xeno's power, especially with the ability to get downs in quick succession on certain maps, but since you're able to apply constant map pressure as Xeno, slugging might feel more frustrating than hooking on this killer. Slugging was incredibly efficient on the Singularity, with only 3 gens being completed in a total of 10 games. While this playstyle is not...
I think this is like, if you had to give like 4 killers that could do the Singularity, is definitely one of them. He's the kind of killer that can just teleport across the entire map at will. He can down people really fast. I'd 100% agree that Slugging Larry would probably actually just straight up be better than hooking.
Recommended for newer Larry players.
Utterly miserable,
Focusing
but
on one slug to get pressure and trying to end chases relatively quickly blends well with his power and playstyle. According to Coco, Singularity is definitely one of the best killers for slugging, and the statistics showcase that. The only real trouble that came from slugging stemmed from the slugs crawling too far away once everyone was on the floor, causing survivors to bleed out unnecessarily. Once the slugging matches ended, the effects of DS, Off the Record, and Dead Hard were immediately noticeable, and the perks were much more prevalent in said games. Despite slugging being more efficient, hooking is still preferred due to comfortability, but if you wanted to take advantage of the slugging playstyle, Larry is definitely the best at the skill set. Since the character has a testy history with the general survivor base, despite the higher win rate on the Skull Merchant, slugging is not necessarily recommended for her abilities, especially due to her recent nerfs and changes made by behavior. Pixel's general reluctance was noted, but the higher salt rate and DC rate didn't equate to a more valuable gameplay experience, especially since being able to hook provides Skull Merchant with a wider variety of ability to get the survivors out of the game.
Oh my god, the fucking 45% DC rate. Yeah, that's about right.
Since the main skill ceiling for Skull Merchant relies on laser tagging and cutting down chases, being able to down survivors isn't more advantageous versus someone like Dracula or Twins. It was noted that the use of Off the Record was more frustrating to deal with once the hooking games continued, but overall,
thank you for that.
Hooking was more beneficial than slugging in this case. Despite Knight's power having a bit of encouragement when it comes to slugging, the overall consensus was that hooking is still preferred, not for difficulty, but for the lack of enjoyment for the players. Games felt much longer when slugging as the Knight, and the lack of slug patrol for the guards made it a bit easier to reset against, versus having guards patrol the hook area where survivors are located. Slugging is encouraged a bit when it comes to the Knight, especially because guards are able to intercept any sort of flashlight or pallet save or salvo attempt from nearby survivors. Anti-tunnel was noted, especially with weaponized DS in the hooking matches, but Knights should be aware that the matches do feel longer with slugging, but you can be advantageous when needed. Opinions on whether or not slugging was more beneficial were actually split between the two mains, as Scooty preferred the slugging playstyle but acknowledged some minute difficulties, while Shader was not a fan, toting longer games overall and noted the definite frustrations that the survivors had when they went against the
I feel like everything we've seen so far is super neutral. Like, I feel like this is not favoring one side or the other at all, right? I mean, it just could, that's just how the killers were laid out, but I feel like this has been pretty back and forth so far.
The benefits with slugging from Wesker are definitely noted, with his infection rate and survivors being reset once they're hooked. You're able to stall significantly more when slugging versus hooking, but it more so took advantage of bad or uncoordinated teams in most situations. The DC and salt rate were immensely lower on the hooking games, but Wesker's power does a really good job at hindering survivors' ability to reset themselves, so maybe more of a personal opinion since the division is split. Dredge is an excellent slugger, almost more so than Behavior's Intent, especially with the continuous buffs and pressure that Nightfall give the Dredge. While hooking presents more ability for slowdown usage, slugging was noted as the more aggressive playstyle for the Dredge and came with much higher benefits, but it definitely was not fun on the end for the survivors. A good chunk of the survivors ended up giving up during the Dredge's slugging games, as the combination of knockout paired with Nightfall left uncoordinated teams stumbling.
That's the problem, like, with getting this data. If you look at the DC rate, it's like literally... it's triple. It is literally triple. And if someone DCs, the game's essentially over, and I have no doubt that they counted that as a win. They still probably played the match out and counted it as a win. But I feel like the mental aspect of this is so important that it invalidates like the entire thing. Because people are infinitely less likely to try to actually continue to win in this type of scenario. So the fact that the DC rate is 3 times higher here is, I think that's more telling than the win rate change, because once that guy DCs it, the game's basically over. You got a bot that's going to just crouch in a corner, do nothing for the rest of the match. So that DC rate is insane.
Per gaming athlete, Dredge is incredible at slugging, but it definitely wasn't fun or fair for the survivors. Sadako used to be one of the undisputed queens of slugging, but Behavior has done a phenomenal job at taking away this playstyle from her. And despite the higher win rate on the slugging games, for the most part, slugging doesn't quite fit into her power and playstyle, since you're able to remove the tapes when hooking survivors, while slugging lets them keep it, helping survivors get rid of stacks that much easier. With Sadako, her power allows you to build immense pressure with survivors running around the map, and you get excellent map mobility while building condemns, and since slugs don't build condemn stacks, half of her power ends up being negated by this playstyle, so it is overall not recommended. Between Vez and I, there were notable differences in our games, especially with the reintroduction of anti-tunnel perks for our hooking games.
Holy
Slugging
shit!
allowed us to pull survivors off of
70% salt rate? What are you doing to these people, Carniveris? What the fuck are you doing? That is like more than Skull Merchant. Oh, why is this the stat I'm more excited about? What's the salt rate? Why is it relevant? I don't care. It's interesting to note, though. I guess they're just playing artist. I guess just generally being good at artist is pretty much all you need for salt.
gens and really force survivors to decide whether they were going to be altruistic or try to salvage gen progress when possible. And I definitely noticed the difference in pressure when survivors adopted an every man for themselves approach, instead of trying to help out their team or trying to reset with builds. As a competitive player, Vez's strategy preferred slugging to negate certain perks like Deliverance, and to avoid the 70 to 100 seconds of a hook stage that survivors would have had to play around, making the playstyle effective in limiting second chance perks, and denying self-fund perks that would give the survivors more time to try to escape the trial. As someone who prefers aura rating perks like Barbecue, it was definitely a change of pace and was a playstyle that didn't allow me to go for more long-range shots, but it definitely was more effective. Slugging overall was much easier on Pinhead than other killers, resulting in quicker matches and a positive outcome. With the exception of Unbreakable and Exponential, the lack of anti-tunnel and second chance perks that were negated made matches a breeze. Pinhead's Chain Hunt also helped when it came to resetting, with healing being put to a standstill and the ability to know where survivors were to keep up the constant pressure. Slugging was incredibly strong on Pinhead. With the exception of Unbreakable and Exponential, the lack of anti-tunnel and second chance perks that were negated made matches a breeze. Pinhead's Chain Hunt also helped when it came to resetting, with healing being put to a standstill and the ability to...
These stats are perplexing to me, by the way. This is incredibly perplexing. That a slugging bleed out build had a 0.02% DC rate and a 10% salt rate. That is perplexing. I think that really just goes, yeah, the sample size is just not big enough. Because this makes no sense to me. Absolutely no sense.
Know where survivors were to keep up the constant pressure. Slugging was incredibly strong on Pinhead, and it definitely made him one of the best killers for the playstyle. Despite the overall higher win rate on Nemesis, it was definitely a feast or famine type of gameplay, and was notably more frustrating for this killer's playstyle.
30% win rate hooking? What are you doing? What the fuck? Who has a 30% win rate with Nemesis? That cannot be right. This is what I mean, man. There's so much variability in these. Like, it's perfectly possible they just picked a guy who was newer to Nemesis or something like that, and that's completely fine. But even then, that's just that tweaks things so much. Like, all this data is cool to have, but it really doesn't mean, like, anything. Player skill is an immensely important part in determining whether or not something is better. I would say, like, even slugging, you need to be aware of more shit. Like, even the requirements for the playstyles require different knowledge sets and stuff like that. So, I don't know.
And it definitely brought out the nastiness in the killer's games. Games went from focusing on chases to struggling to find slugs and proxying for pressure, and the negativity came from being more empathetic towards survivors, noticing that it wasn't necessarily the most fun playstyle to go against. Despite the win rate being better, as the nemesis typically goes for 8 hooks before killing survivors, it wasn't the most adaptive and denied some of the aspects for pressure. Tunneling memes aside, denying resets and keeping survivors infected is an important part with keeping up as nemesis.
Did that guy say he specifically only goes for 8 hooks before killing people? Because if that's the case, then sure, trying to go for 12 hooks every single game. Even then, it shouldn't be 30%, but I could see it being, like, lower.
But you don't have much to gain with this playstyle, so it's definitely up to personal preference.
See, that seems so rigged, though. Yeah, why is he doing the fucking experiment, then? His data's meaningless. I don't know. I'm sure that dude's a cool nemesis, but that completely invalidates the whole point. Because he's trying an immense, harder challenge over just slugging people. Like, you're not putting the same effort into both of these things.
With the inclusion of main event, Trickster excels in providing pressure in high volume areas and is able to take advantage of grouped up survivors and denying pickups with slugs. Trickster doesn't generate the best amount of map pressure from hooks, so slugging allows you to keep pressure on survivors and does well with punishing pickups and altruism. Main event keeps Trickster's uptime high, but can be in trouble due to his ammo dependency. The noticeable lack of anti-tunnel helps elevate his gameplay, and the longer hook times take time away from killers and allowing survivors to focus more on gens, and be stuck either trading or leaving the area. Rev does include slugging in his build and his playstyle normally, so the 4 on the floor requirement for the killer in this experiment was more comfortable than other killers, but the benefits are definitely undeniable with Trickster. Now, the results may be a bit skewed when it comes to Momo and his win rate, but Blight's mobility and overall prowess makes matches a breeze whether you're slugging or hooking. Match outcome wasn't necessarily affected by the killer.
This data is meaningless. This man literally has 76,000 wins in a row and everything. It's going to be 100% on both.
Just replicated
this literally
among
useless
all of the
data.
S-tier killers as we get to them. Playstyle will be more of a matter of preference versus what is advantageous, but Blight is definitely killed at keeping survivors on their toes and pressuring multiple downs in a condensed area. Pyramid Head is one of the killers in this experiment where I didn't anticipate that many benefits coming from it, because he's already an outlier in the game and the undisputed tunneling king. With his trail tormenting survivors and allowing him to bypass hooks completely, the results are kind of a given, as he's not necessarily having to deal with the downtime that most killers are experiencing. With his cages negating a lot of the anti-tunnel perks in the game by default, he's definitely a killer that'll be more of a personal preference than anything else.
I think slugging on Pyramid Head makes no sense.
But once you get familiar with cage spawns, you're able to use cages to your advantage, and quickly get survivors out of
For these killers not allowed to tunnel, that's the problem. There's no consistent rule set at all. Some people went for 12 hooks, some people just played normal games, some people did tunnel. Like, there's no consistency, which is what's going to happen when you crowdsource all of your data from various people. It's impossible to get right. And again, I do not fault her whatsoever for not getting accurate data for this, because doing that sounds like an absolute nightmare that would just cause immense suffering to everybody. But it does come with the caveat that this is all sort of meaningless data.
Smaller maps were definitely a key in this playstyle when it came to slugging, but Pyramid Head is his own entity in the realm, and it really shows. Deathslinger was a killer where the slugging and hooking came at more of a neutral outcome, but slugging was more challenging and required a bit more focus due to the precise nature of Deathslinger and his 110 speed easily being punished. Per Osu, hooking is the way to go because you can use different types of pressure to advance the gameplay, whereas slugging was more reliant on taking advantage of altruistic survivors making poor mistakes against him. Being slower than the majority of the killers does negate his map mobility, but Deathslinger does excel in swapping and pressuring unhook, so it would be more of a matter of personal preference. Oni is the killer in the game that I like to call an opportunistic slugger, where downing and pressuring survivors in a condensed area is built into his power. But since slugs don't drop blood orbs, you're on a time crunch to take advantage of your power as much as possible, and slugging might not be the most beneficial. Slugging is innate with his power and as expected, but for the experiment, it wasn't necessarily more beneficial than the typical hooking playstyle. Slugging opportunistically is common for all killers, of course, but for Oni, since he wants survivors up and injured, it wasn't the most fun or made the most sense.
Yeah, that makes sense, actually.
Like Oni, Plague
you
is
surprisingly do want to hook people as Oni sometimes, because you need to have people bleed somewhere so you can get more power usage. So that actually kind of makes sense, strangely.
an opportunistic slugger that relies on close-knit survivors making poor decisions. Plague is also a killer that works better as time goes on, and slugging early on in the match wasn't always the best play. Regular hooking works better, and like Oni, taking advantage of your power and being able to slug as needed. Plague does suffer a bit of a time sink like the majority of the killers, but with her normal map mobility and reliance on survivors making mistakes, it wasn't showcased to be that much more beneficial, but it did result in quicker matches, but not necessarily more fun ones. While the Legion can have excellent map mobility and the ability to pressure multiple survivors with their frenzy,
can't down people
because
quick
Legion
enough.
can't necessarily get a faster down than the other
Yeah.
M1 killers, as long as everyone stays injured, the power can be negated a bit as long as survivors are also separated from each other. However, because slugging requires the survivors to be altruistic, Legion is able to take advantage of constant mending, and if enough survivors are in the same area, they can chain slugs upon pickup as needed. Both hooking and slugging is viable, but since Legion doesn't have the best reputation in the game, slugging can feel dirtier on this killer in particular, resulting in a higher salt rate, but also kept the games quicker with a higher 4K rate.
Yeah, the DC rate is insane.
As one of the best killers in the game, when she's not bugged, Spirit excels in being able to be lethal to altruistic survivors and is able to cut chases down into slivers with her phases. On top of this, she can be one of the best tunnelers in the game, with how quickly she can be right on top of survivors after being DS'd, and closing the distance you gain from being hit with off the record. Spirit was one of the killers where the overall match time was longer when it came to slugging, but it was mainly due to the slugs reaching the far corners of large maps and making it difficult to find them. Leaving survivors on the ground was more beneficial for the killer, as you didn't have to deal with as much of a time sink since Spirit is 110, and using phasing for distance isn't as recommended. So the extra time actually came from finding slugs rather than the actual overall chase time.
What was the...
Yes, and closing the
85.
distance.
Okay, so basically
making
no
it
difference.
difficult to find them. Leaving survivors on the ground was more beneficial for the killer, as you didn't have to deal with as much of a time sink since Spirit is 110,
Spies from
and
the
using
shadows.
phasing for distance isn't as recommended. So the
Psychos.
extra time actually came from finding slugs rather than the actual overall chase time. Clown had
course,
an
Ellie.
incredibly in-depth review, so I'll be pulling this section
After.
directly with quotes rather than restating from the post-experiment questionnaire. While there were times where slugging felt easier than conventional gameplay, I
Oh
want
my
to put a lot
god,
of
the
emphasis
fucking
on my
salt rate. Honestly, I've watched this guy play. That's about accurate.
belief that I think many clown players will struggle if they attempt to recreate the same outcome. Much of my success was dependent on my vested understanding of how to play clown and chase. Those who struggle to use clown's bottles effectively will enable survivors to either stall out healing resets or finish generators given the playstyle doesn't have any tools, including corrupt, to stall out gen repair progress. Slugging as clown is very feast or famine. You're either going to win or lose big. Conventional gameplay is at least more likely to result in middling outcomes where one at the very least might tie against the survivors. It is unlikely to tie when slugging due to the lack of generator slowdown.
How did the
tools in
salt rate
tandem
go
with the clown's
down?
lack of
What?
mobility for macro pressure. This being said, slugging does have its advantages. With the recent extension to hook timers, survivors have been capitalizing on the extra 10 seconds to achieve more repair progress with each hook state. This is especially
Can't get
punishing
tunneled if
against
you're
clown
slugged,
since
true.
he lacks map mobility tools, and as a result, may find himself needing to tunnel in more circumstances than before. In turn, the
point.
existence of anti-tunneling tools creates a lose-lose situation for Clown, given that he's punished for needing to make the right chase decisions due to the overall flow and state of the match. This loss of momentum from perks like DS, Off the Record, or even Dead Hard can completely remove the possibility that Clown can recover enough over the course of the match to get 3 or more kills.
I like how they're going
The
over
main
every single
difference for
killer.
Pig, besides changing the build, was actually focusing on a different add-on combination to synergize with his playstyle, as Pig is another killer that does well as the game progresses, due to the bear trap mechanic putting pressure on survivors as they complete gens. Dress also mentioned that their games with Pig didn't actually have frustrations in the builds, but in RNG and map design ruining their gameplay. Pig is more opportunistic in the playstyle of trying to get to a 3v1 as fast as possible, or to get as many survivors trapped as possible, as their completing gens already gives you more time in game. But against coordinated survivors, the Pig already doesn't do well, and this was elevated more in the slugging games. Since you want survivors to complete gens and focus on more quicker chases, slugging and hooking can go in tandem, but it's not as advantageous as other killers. Like most of the M1 killers, Freddy showed improvement in the kill rate for the matches, and Wes noted the lack of downtime
Freddy.
being more beneficial for the killer, as he was able to keep track of survivors in the Dream Realm and not having to worry about some of the more beefier second chance perks that pose issues for M1 killers overall. His hooking matches after the fact were noticeably more frustrating, citing gen rushing also being an issue, as the amount of gen perks that are available have been able to keep track of
Yeah.
survivors for M1 killers
So
overall.
every
His hooking
single, like
matches
I've
after
noticed every single instance in which the win rate is higher, or at least almost every single one, the DC rate is literally like 3 times higher. And that is so important in impacting the DC rate. Well, I'll make my conclusions like when we're done here, but that is so impactful
The fact were noticeably
because
more
they're counting
frustrating,
those games.
citing gen rushing also being an issue as the amount of gen perks that are available have been nerfed and not providing as much synergy or preference with the killer's power. However, West did note that he felt bad for the survivors on the ground as some bled out due to the nature of the experiment. One of the biggest upsets with our Bubba was how effective the slugging playstyle was compared to the hooking one, especially on maps that were notably more survivor-sided, like Mother's Dwelling and Greenville. Bubba was able to focus more on chases with slugging rather than hooking, and Epi was happy that he didn't have to break off chases to focus on gen pressure. When he got to the hooking matches, he noted his frustration with survivors that got unhooked taking chase and trying to force their perks, while those who were unhooked hid for fear of being chased. It ended up having to lead into a more tunneling and camping playstyle, which he didn't want to go for, instead preferring to just slug and trace around the map instead.
Wait, what'd you say, Hens? Also, what's up, man? If you were to not count them, wouldn't it bias it towards the other side? People are more likely to DC when they're losing. If you were to not count them, what's them? Sorry. Oh, the DC rates. I think that's what you're talking about. Games were summoned DCs. If you were to not count them, wouldn't it bias it towards the other side? Towards the side of what? I don't know what stance you are. Sorry. I think so, King. Still wild that only 4K counts, not hatch. Yeah, that's weird too. They shouldn't count towards the win rate, but they should be recorded. Oh yeah, no, I'm all for recording the data. I think that's actually fascinating. I love that shit. If you don't count the games where survivors DC, you will not count a lot of games where survivors are losing. Oh, because it's sort of like a snowballing thing. I get what you're saying. I mean, there's no good way to address that, is there? Because yeah, there's just no really solving that. I get what you're saying, but unfortunately there doesn't really appear to be a solution. If anything, I just count that as interesting data, but it does. My brain is telling me that if the DC rate is 3 times higher and the win rate happens to be higher too, it's because people have mentally given up easier than the other matches. It's just a conclusion I'm drawing from it. It doesn't necessarily mean that's exactly happened. But yeah, I mean, I get what you're saying. But it does, there is definitely a pattern there. And I think that pattern is at least worth, noticing.
Per Epi, honestly, slugging is super effective, but it shouldn't be. Survivors are in a very strong spot right now, but the issue is that survivors are not good enough at the game to make the strength useful a lot of the time.
Rude.
With her recent hatchet buffs, Huntress was a complete natural at slugging, and the biggest frustration from the slugging games came from hatchets being dedicated on the server, rather than survivors being able to counter it. Slugging games came with an overall improvement, and the playstyle was mentioned as being the best if they ever decided to go for win streaks because of how effective the games were. Huntress gets punished more so than others because of the lack of mobility, and if you accidentally tunnel, you was mentioned as being the best if they ever decided to go for win streaks because of how effective the games were. Huntress gets punished more so than others because of the lack of mobility, and if you accidentally tunnel, you pay the price.
Wait, the DC rate was the exact same for... What are the odds of that? What? They had the exact same 22% DC rate for slugging and hooking? Monka,
Immensely. Slugging on Huntress meant overall shorter chases with good snowball potential, and with precise hits made altruism near impossible. Despite this, Huntress is also a killer that it is notably near impossible to unhook in front of, especially in basement situations. But when it came to slugging, she was a beast at it. Because you can't heal when you're in tier 3, the combination of anti-healing perks and uncoordinated survivors meant that Doctor was an excellent slugger when is able to really shine in this experiment. Doctor's built-in tracking also helps with the ability to snowball survivors trying to be altruistic in the surrounding area. Slugging for Doctor is definitely stronger than intended against the average player, and even more experienced Swifts because of the information and extra
It was 100% both times. What's the difference? Oh, because it took longer, maybe? Does it really matter? I guess if the argument you're only getting to is... I feel like the match duration doesn't really matter too much, but I think she's referring to the opinion of the player. Oh, okay.
Doctor's built-in tracking also helps with the ability to snowball survivors trying to be altruistic in the surrounding area.
Right, but why did the player come up with that conclusion is what I'm curious about. If it's just based off of the win rate, then yeah, naturally, of course, going for more hooks is just going to take longer. I don't think that that's a dig on the playstyle. It just means the games lasting longer doesn't mean the games are worse or better for you, really, in my opinion, especially considering blood points and things like that. If you get to the same result, it kind of like, yeah, if you're going to hook, it's just going to, of course, take longer by default. Slugging, you're skipping a portion of the game to get to the same result, but that doesn't necessarily mean it was. I don't know. That's actually an interesting point of discussion. Just because you can do something, the same thing, faster by circumventing it in another way, does that mean it's objectively better? In terms of like getting blood points and shit like that, it's obviously worse. In terms of getting MMR, it's also worse. So I don't know that I agree there. Because your MMR is based on your duration in the game as well. So actually, if you do it quicker, you're actually gaining less MMR. The goal is to win, right? But if you win in 10 minutes over winning in 5 minutes, you gain more MMR in the 10-minute one. The duration of the match has been proven to be a factor in the amount of MMR that you gain. So actually, the longer lasting matches would give you more. So if we're going purely comp mindset, just numbers, it would be better to have a slower match. Well, again, once we're at that 10-minute mark, then I think the 10-minute is the cutoff point. Then it doesn't matter. But this is a pedantic nitpick. Not really. How is that a pedantic nitpick? The person is coming up with the conclusion that the slugging build was better because their win rate was the same. The only variability here is the duration of the match. So I'm not really sure how that's... If you get to the exact same result and you get more MMR, because I feel like the original premise was based off of basing a win off of gaining MMR. That's what Carniveris said earlier in the video. So if we're going by MMR gains, winning too quickly, you actually get less MMR. Longer matches equals Survivor were able to fight back longer. Well, it's because you're separating... It's not necessarily that either. It's because you're separating into multiple different hook states, each of which can take 2 minutes times, 8 times. So just numerically, it is going to last longer, most of the time anyway. It's not really better or worse. It's just one thing takes longer or shorter. And you could certainly make the argument as well from the other side. If you can kill people quicker, that's all that matters. And if that's what you're focused on, then sure. But you would be less rewarded for doing so. And I guess it depends on whether or not you find that more important or not. So, is this video based on a comp mindset? Yeah, it definitely seems to be.
Is definitely stronger than intended against the average player.
If it's easier to win, it's better. Again, we're equating duration with ease. That doesn't necessarily mean it's easier. Like, for example, I can turn my brain off more games and just hook people and chase people and do whatever. It's easier for me to do that because I have to put less effort involved. If I'm trying to slug 4 people and keep track of shit, where's the last guy down? How far is that guy recovered? Is that going to be able to get there in time? I feel like there's so much more shit to worry about. Have you ever tried slugging? Yeah, I mean, I slug all the time. Are you talking about like 4-man bleed out sluggings? In which case, no, I've not tried that because I'm not pure evil. I even for purposes of experiments, I will not do that to people. But I can't imagine that's going to be less stressful. At least when someone's hooked, I know where they are. I know where the unhook is going to happen. I have knowledge of this shit like at all times. But I feel like if I'm trying to slug 4 people, I'm going to be so much more stressed about it. Only off-stream Scott would slug. That is fake news. There is no off-stream DVD Scott. But yeah, I mean, that's fair because I've never done it before. But I feel like that would be so much more stressful to me. That just seems so much stressful. Or so much more stressful anyway.
And even more experienced Swifts because of the information and extra time you gain with his
I did
madness.
play 2v8 off stream,
Despite
yes.
being an M1 killer, he's able to shut down chases effectively as well, shining high above some of his other counterparts with the time saving. As one of the few trap killers in the game, Hag excels at pressuring survivors stuck in her web, rather than being able to take advantage of a slug situation.
She definitely should be better with hooks.
The slug's ability to crawl away from her area of control meant that they got picked up, and because of her slow chase speed and lack of ranged ability to make up for it, it meant that the games were overall more difficult than if she'd been able to pressure the survivors going for
That makes perfect sense.
Slugging people in an area that you have set up
Oh
is
my
incredibly easy
God.
to hag, but in
She won 8 times
general,
more. Holy
getting
fuck.
one person on the hook and then punishing altruism that way seems to be more preferred and an overall better playstyle. She still punishes altruism, but since she has to rely on big brain thinking and her web, it doesn't make much sense to slug as much as the experiment required. Myers is another killer that is along the lines of an opportunistic slugger, but his downfall is that he only has so many times that he can pop his tier 3 if he's not bringing infinite.
Dude, that needs to change. I don't know how it's been 8 years. You can still run out of your power with Myers. It's so stupid. I don't understand. It's so dumb.
needs to focus on getting people out of the game as effectively as possible, slugging wasn't necessarily the most beneficial since he has his insta-down ability to help with the resets. But he is undeniably good at slugging. Myers' mobility is average, meaning that he'd have to stick around the slugged area if he wanted to punish altruism, but the ability to stalk survivors might be wasted if everyone was injured, denying a good chunk of his power. Slugging wasn't necessarily
every single time I've been comparing the DC rate to the win rate, and every single time the DC rate is like 6 times higher.
If everyone was injured, denying a good chunk of his power. Despite the win rate being a bit higher, the salt rate wasn't worth the playstyle advantages, and Myers is definitely best left to slug and burst when the moment arises, rather than going for it on purpose.
I agree.
As the best killer in the game, honestly, there isn't much to say, because once you're good at Nurse, slug or not, you'll end up winning the majority of your games. The win rate—
How did Alf win 60% of his fucking games as Nurse? What? What is the story behind this? No, I don't believe this. This is— something is wrong here. That is ridiculous. This data is so scuffed. There is no way Alf won 60% of his games as Nurse. With a good build, too. There's just zero chance. Something is fucked with this data. I'm sorry. I need to, like, understand why that's the case. Gay people hatch lack of consistency and shit like that. Like, well, then the data is meaningless again. I'm sorry. There is no way Alf trying to win with Nurse has a 60% win rate. There is zero way that... This is the most interesting thing about the video right here. This makes no fucking sense. Absolutely no sense.
On Nurse was lower because most of Alf survivors ended up just trying to camp or bait for hatch, resulting in a lot of 3Ks, as the majority of his games also resulted in no gens being completed. Like Blight, do or do not, you'll win, or bait for hatch, resulting in a lot of 3Ks. Was lower because most of Alf survivors ended up just trying to camp or bait for hatch, resulting in a lot of 3Ks, as the majority of his games also resulted in no gens being completed. Like Blight, do or do not, you'll win. Alf, in his words—
Wait, so does the 3K not count as the win then? This is what I mean. She's counting the 3Ks as a loss? I'm so confused. 3K counts as a loss. Okay, well, this entire thing doesn't work then. Because slugging is obviously better for hatch. Okay, well, yeah, that completely invalidates literally this entire video then.
Is a piece of shit who has slugged for years and will continue to do so because it's stupid easy on Nurse, and is also much easier to take advantage of than other killers. Another S-tier killer, there was slight improvement to the gameplay with slugging that resulted in overall less gens being completed.
I feel like Billy would be good at slugging.
So focused on altruism and trying to reset against the chainsaw. Slugging games were a bit more overstimulating for the killer, and oftentimes it felt like matches were wasted after resets when you don't have any hook states.
She said at the beginning, I know, I talked about it, I just didn't believe it until now.
And other second chance perks were immediately noticed. And
no, I did realize that. Remember, I talked about that. One of the first things I said was the factor of hatch here is going to be a big determining factor here. I guess I just didn't really see the win rate. I didn't see the physical text in front of me to go, oh wow, that's really stupid. Because I did say that right at the start.
Weaponized against Billy, with survivors essentially throwing themselves at the killer in order to use their perks. Stan was content to keep survivors on the ground because of the nature of Billy, the perks used, and the fact that less gens were getting done. But it does make the matches feel more claustrophobic since the play area can be smaller than normal. With Wraith, slugging was overall much easier, and it kept track of survivors' positioning and game
I can see Wraith doing good with
term.
slugging.
Swifts were noted as an issue as the coordination led being able to take advantage of Wraith, and the repetitive gameplay that Wraith also experiences in a day-to-day made Seven wish that the survivors were just out of the game, rather than continuously slugging them. He noted the situational frustration for Wraith, where slugging was difficult against coordinated teams, but hooking matches were difficult because of Sabo squads and survivors weaponizing their second chance perks. The slugging matches against not-so-coordinated teams made matches overall much quicker than normal, with less than 1 gen being completed on average. Slugging gameplay is all about balance, according to Seven, where slugging is more advantageous in most situations, especially when you don't have to worry about the time sink to hooking or having your progress ruined by saves. But there can be benefits to hooking since you're able to secure deaths that much easier. Finally, with the Trapper, hooking just seems to come more naturally for this killer, especially with the ability to shut down saves in most buildings and take advantage of the basement more so than other killers. As an M1 killer, there's no extra map mobility that came with his kit, and if survivors are not chasing in your setup, it can feel difficult to have the extra pressure you might need. If basement is available, it makes more sense to hook as Trapper than Slug, but Trapper still makes saving a Slug teammate dangerous, since they are more often than not stuck in a trapped area. It made minute differences in gameplay, but like Hag, Trapper can definitely make hook saves more dangerous, requiring at times more than one survivor survivor to go for it if the survivor is hooked in the wrong area. It wasn't necessarily the best gameplay, but it can work out in your favor depending on where the downed survivor is on the map. If you made it this far, thank you so much for watching my video, and please try to be civil with discussion in any sort of social media post or comment section.
She has more
and again,
Oryx
not doing
cells
this
than
for
me.
malicious reasons, but doing so out of curiosity for a viewpoint that I've noticed over the last few months. I'm incredibly thankful to everyone that participated in the experiment, as well as those who have helped me behind the scenes with consultation, data entry, and emotional support. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next one.
Yeah, of course I will link this video. 1 second. Here you go. I'll be linking to it on YouTube as well. So overall, I would say, I think if anything, the data about salt rates and DC rates and stuff like that was the most telling. All right, so how do we structure the summary of this? The initial claim here, I believe, is that a full slugging playstyle is more beneficial than going for hooks and occasional slugging because it circumvents more defenses that survivors are currently bringing at the time of this video being made. Which, if that is the argument being made and that's it, you're just simply trying to avoid certain perks and things like that, then I would have to agree that at the time of this video being made, that is probably true. The question is whether or not this is overall a strategy that you should practice for the game, and my answer is absolutely no. I don't think, first of all, in terms of just pure game health, you can see the DC rates are literally 4 to 5, 6, 7 times higher when people are doing this. Obviously, you can take people DC for whatever reasons nowadays. People are just pathetic, but that is not an ignorable amount of difference. It is obviously 10 times more annoying to go against. So it's just a miserable thing that shouldn't be pushed for. Now, if it was like, if it was a world where like killer's impossible, you can't win as killer anymore. People are getting like 3% win rates. The only way you can win is doing this. If that's the kind of thing that we had to move towards, then I would be like, okay, this is a necessary evil. They have fucked this game. Killers just cannot win anymore. But I just don't feel like killer is bad at all right now. The desync thing is obviously annoying for both of us, for survivor and killer, but I just don't feel like killer is bad enough to warrant such a nasty strategy becoming a thing. And even if it did, there are still so many perks that can combat it that I still don't think it would even be more effective at its absolute best as well. So even if we did have a scenario where that's all killers did, no one hooked any anymore, we would just see a whole bunch of anti-slugging builds that would be probably more effective than the anti-tunnel perks. Because think about like the value of off the record, for example. What's the value of off the record if a killer wants to tunnel you? You get unhooked, you're hit, off the record's gone. You've used it in 3 seconds. That's the whole thing. The killer can hear that you have it, they know you have it, they can plan around it. Off the record, despite being one of the best anti-tunnel perks, is pretty easily countered by just fucking immediately hitting the person off the hook. So you can do that if you really want to. But a lot of the perks that deal with anti-slugging are not really counterable in that way. Unbreakable has essentially no counter. If you don't know they have it, they're just back up again. You can't know that they have that. Exponential, you can hear if it's nearby, but you have to guess that it's exponential. We're Gonna Live Forever and Made for This essentially has no counterplay whatsoever. If someone runs up and just picks someone up in front of you, they can now spread out, and then that'll chain together into more saves. I think the impact of anti-slugging perks are stronger than the impact of anti-tunneling perks. On their highest level, the value of an Unbreakable will always be more than the value of like an Off the Record or something like that. At least in my opinion, that's how I feel. I feel like I've never really lost a game because of Off the Record, but I've lost a ton of games due to Unbreakable or something like that, or a end game We're Gonna Live Forever pickup or something like that. That shit, I lose games to that way, way, way more. When anti-slugging perks should be talking about, or what slugging perks should be talking about. For anti-slugging, I'm talking about Made for This, Exponential, Unbreakable, We're Gonna Live Forever, even Buckle Up, Flip-Flop even. Flip-Flop Power Struggle is a thing people just run. I feel like there are more impactful anti-slug perks than there are impactful anti-tunnel perks. For the people, kinda. I'm not even going to count for the people, because if you're having a slug-heavy game like this, you're likely not going to be healed. You're likely just going to be injured, and you can't do it then. Plot Twist. Oh yeah, Plot Twist, by the way, is one of the best anti-this playstyles in the entire game. If everyone runs Plot Twist and you know the killer's like slugging, just, even if you don't know the killer's slugging, because you're going to get picked up probably once at least in the match, and you see he's not hooking anybody, just down yourself. It's, the killer is fucked. If they're trying this playstyle and you have Plot Twist, you're just fucked. You can't do it because as soon as you're about to down the person, they will just down themselves. And now you have to pick them up, or you've just given them a full free heal. And granted, it's once per match, but if everyone's got that, you're resetting 8 health states per match, and that you're just so fucked. And nothing anti-tunnel is going to be as strong as that, at least in my opinion. So just overall, for just my opinions on that, I never see this being more effective than just hooking with the occasional smart pressure-based proximity slugging. I'm not saying never slug. Obviously, slugging is vital sometimes. You need to sometimes even. But this whole playstyle that is being pushed here, which is 4 bleed outs on the ground, essentially, this should never be pushed because even if it was better, to me, it's like 1% better to the point where do you really want to ruin the entire fucking community to make your game like 1% easier or something like that? And then again, I've seen so many people that do this get frustrated by the anti-slugging perks as well in the exact same opposite direction. So now instead of bitching about Off the Record and Blood Rush and DS, we're bitching about Buckle Up and For the People and not even those. We're Gonna Live Forever, Made for This, Unbreakable, Exponential. Like there's so many better perks than the ones I even just said. So I think we don't need to make this game's community worse. Now, in terms of the actual video itself, I loved all the data. I just think it doesn't mean anything at all. There was no consistency between the builds used between different killers. Map RNG is obviously a huge thing. The hour difference, like she said, was between 1,000 and 13,000. Absolutely massive difference. Some people don't know how to slug properly. Some people seem to have their own self-imposed rules where they tried to go for 12 hooks. Some people just gig at tunnel and stuff like that. There was no consistent rule set among anything whatsoever. And if you're going to do an experiment to get data like this and you want consistent data, you need to have boring, same controls. It's boring. I understand why no one wanted to do it because it's fucking boring. But you can't have some people, like the Nemesis, wasn't even trying to actively win. And then we're also not counting the hatch. The hatch is another massive flaw because Alf with a 60% win rate didn't have a 60% win rate. He said they usually didn't even finish a single generator. He was destroying them. But the win rate counted as 60% because people were getting hatch because he wasn't slugging. Slugging inherently is anti-hatch. So if you have a playstyle that's anti-hatch, but then you count that factor as a win compared to a loss, that makes no fucking sense. And that, I think, is the most pressing part about the entire thing. The last point I would say is people are far more likely to give up when slugged compared to just hooked. And again, I know there's a DC epidemic, there's a give up epidemic, and it's horrible. But you just saw from, again, her own data, which was great, that on the slug games, the DC rate was like 5 times higher almost every single game. So people are far more likely to give up, which means you're also going to win easier because people are far less likely to try. But that's a bit harder to gauge because also you can't not count games like that because those would be games that you would be winning, so it would skew it as well. So overall, I think the data here was cool. It just means literally nothing. Like the data is, it's basically pointless. And the only way you could really do this is with like the same player with the same build, like 100 games in a row, 50 games each, 50 games out. But I would never subject anyone to do that. And I do not blame her for not subjecting people to that as well, because no sane human being would ever do that. So the data is pretty meaningless, but also acquiring the data is torture. So I'm not going to expect people to do that. Ignoring the idea that blindness perks only fuck with solo queue and not survive with friends. Yeah, there was also an extreme solo queue bias there. Perks like Third Seal and Knockout and shit like that are heavily stronger against solo queue as opposed to something like Off the Record and DS and shit like that. Although I'm comparing it to survivor perks compared to like, Pain Res or Pop or something like that. There's no real difference between survive with friends and solo. So there's a discrepancy there as well. But overall, if I had to give a final message about this, don't do this. This will not become a dominant meta thing. Don't even try to start it. People will counter it even if you are going to. All it's going to do is make the community worse while probably not making you win anymore. And in fact, you're probably just going to get even more frustrated. Is it stronger or not? On some killers, a couple of killers, yes, it is stronger. I would say for the vast majority, it's probably just about equal. We're just trading one set of anti-tunnel perks and defense perks like that to anti-slug perks. You're just moving it to a different level of annoyance to deal with. So overall, yeah, cool video, cool data. I love seeing the salt rates, by the way. I think that was my favorite part. But in terms of drawing a conclusion from that, I cannot conclusively agree that this means anything. But I do appreciate Carniveris for going through all that. And again, I do not blame her even slightly for not doing this the correct way, because the correct way is just torture. Like, ridiculous. That is going to be at least for this video. And if you're watching this on YouTube, I'll obviously link that in the description. But thanks for watching. Goodbye.